Song for Whale, Chapter 35. Now that Blue 55 was singing again, I could keep better track of where he was. But there's nothing to do except let the ship bring us closer. Even if we did get to the sanctuary on time, I wouldn't get to see him. The expedition crew wasn't even willing to take a speaker on board to play the song, so they sure weren't going to pick up a stray girl. Maybe I'd at least get to see Blue 55 swimming. If he decided to hang around the sanctuary, even from a distance, I could recognize his blow spout. That would have to be enough, since he wasn't going to hear the song I'd made for him. He still wouldn't know anyone heard him. When I got back home, I'd send the song to more sanctuaries along his path. Maybe one of them would play it when he swam by. I wouldn't be there to meet him, but he'd know he wasn't alone. The train that Benny showed us had a scenic ride that a lot of cruise passengers took during the port stop at Cape Oliver. The round trip ride took 3 hours and it stopped at the halfway point for a break so people could get out and take pictures and buy lunch. Instead of getting on the train ride back to the ship, Graham and I would catch a shuttle to Lighthouse Bay. If we got there before Blue 55 did, we'd hang around until he arrived, even if it meant missing the rest of the cruise. I didn't want to think about the other thing that might happen. We could go to Lighthouse Bay to find out Blue 55 had already come and gone. That afternoon, I joined Benny and Sura on the bridge for the fjord tour. Sura would make an announcement about the scenery and wildlife around us as the ship sailed through a narrow passage with walls of glaciers on either side. Benny said a local pilot would get on board to help the captain. I thought pilots were only for flying planes, but it turned out that it was also what they call people who steer ships. Anyway, this local pilot, who knew the area a lot better than the captain, would guide the ship around the ice so we wouldn't crash into anything. The ship eased into the narrow passage of the fjord. Ice bobbed in the water, pushed aside by the waves created by the ship. Seals lounged at the base of the mountain and on ice floes. The ice reflected more shades of blue that didn't have names for. I never knew snow cone syrup blue was a color found in nature. I closed my eyes for a few seconds to see if I could still picture it. Maybe I'd never see another glacier again, so I wanted to hold on to that color. Benny tapped my arm, then pointed to the right after I opened my eyes. Watch, she signed. At first, I didn't see what I was supposed to be looking at. Then, blocks of ice tumbled into the water next to us, making waves that splashed onto the rocks. I pointed and shrugged to ask Benny how she knew that was going to happen. She pointed to her ear. So they'd heard it? Some kind of sound warned them the glacier was breaking apart. More chunks of ice crashed into the water. Melting ice always looked so quiet, but this was noisy. The counter in front of us wasn't vibrating when I touched it, so it was a different kind of sound than a foghorn. Benny pointed to a glacier next to us, then wrote Calving on our notepad. I looked back at the glacier, still wondering what such a crashing and falling apart sounded like. She signed something that looked like break and then watch. A giant block of ice separated from the glacier and floated away from the mountain. On the page where Benny had written Calving, I added, like a baby glacier. Yeah, a glacier calf, she wrote. What does it sound like? She covered her ears and said, loud. What kind of loud? I wrote. Really loud. But there were all kinds of loud. I knew that much. Was it a scream, a crash, maybe the opposite of a crash? Whatever that was, since this was a ripping apart. Benny tapped the pen against her mouth like she was thinking. She could tell I wanted to know more, even without my asking her. Then she wrote, thunder. I never would have guessed that two totally different events could make the same sound. She wrote more notes and used some signs to tell me what her mom was announcing. Air bubbles have been trapped under the ice for hundreds of years. All that pressure squishes them out of shape. When the ice melts or breaks away, the bubbles make a loud pop, like they were screaming out after being trapped for so long. I pointed to the seals and wrote, "The noise doesn't bother them?" She shook her head. "They hang out here on purpose. The glacier noise makes it hard for orcas to hear them." Like with the humpbacks bubble net feeding, I wondered how the seals figured out that a noise could help them. Instead of using it to get food like the whales did, the seals used it to avoid becoming food. The ship inched along through the fjord. Looking ahead, I didn't see how we'd be able to squeeze through a narrow space between the mountains. As we got closer, I saw that there was plenty of water on either side of us. Still, the pilot had to drive slowly because of all the floating ice. Most looked like chunks that the ship could easily knock aside, but Benny said we were just looking at the tops of those chunks and that most of the ice was below the surface. We were only partway through the fjord when the ship stopped completely. The pilot talked to the captain while pointing at water ahead of us, then shook her head again. Then the captain picked up the microphone. The engine jerked and we started inching backward. The front of the ship turned bit by bit to the left, and I shrugged at Benny, then pantomimed turning the big wheel, even though no one actually turned a wheel to steer the ship. We're turning around. Benny pointed to the floating ice in the water and signed, "Dangerous." Then she took the notepad and wrote that the captain had just announced, "Sometimes you have to know when it's time to give up and turn back."